Hi, welcome to Katie Rants. This is kind of my new approach to doing YouTube videos. Rather than limiting myself just to the pro-life issue, I kind of wanted to expand so that I could just talk about whatever. And it's all in the name, Katie Rants. This is me just talking about whatever's on my mind. So it won't be necessarily all that organized, and I kind of apologize, but also don't apologize for that because these are my videos. And a lot of this actually came from, my husband he watches a lot of YouTube videos especially while he's playing video games and stuff. And I noticed he was watching these videos where people were just sitting there talking about whatever and going off topic and rambling and telling stories. And I'm like, why can't I just do that? So I'm going to do these videos. I'm not expecting them much to come out of them, except I'm going to put them out there. And if people like them, people like them. Okay, cool. So, and this is kind of a supplement to my blog, Pro Life, Pro Liberty on Tumblr. And so if you follow my blog, and if you most likely if you follow my blog and you came here from my blog because I posted this on my blog, so welcome. And so this is just kind of the video version of what I do normally. So if you've been following my blog for a while, this shouldn't feel all that different. So I want to talk today about prepping. This is kind of my first topic that I wanted to get out there. What prepping is and what it's not, and what it is to different people, and what I'm considering as a prepper in light of the pandemic. So first of all, what prepping is, it's just simply the idea of being prepared for potential shifts in your way of life. So at the most basic level, if you have an emergency fund, you're already prepping to a certain extent. You may not realize it. You're saying, hey, something could happen in the future that could put my livelihood at stake, whether it's a severe injury, a cancer diagnosis, a job loss, whatever the case may be. And I need to be prepared for that financially. So a lot of people prep financially, but they don't always prep for other things. So natural disasters are a big one. If you're kind of just getting into prepping, one thing to look at is natural disasters, and whatever that may be for you. So if you live in an area that's tornado prone, right, you need to look at, okay, what do I do to prepare for a tornado? If you live in an area that gets hurricanes, so there's, depending on where you live, you may have different things you need to prepare for. And so I recommend really researching that and understanding what are the vulnerabilities that you have where you live and with your lifestyle. What are the things that could disrupt your way of life? Either temporarily or in some cases permanently. And but for serious preppers, the people who call themselves preppers and say, hey, I'm a prepper, a lot of us are concerned about things that could end our society and way of life and civilization as we know it. So things that are not going to just affect us directly for a temporary period of time. Things like a natural disaster, they disrupt and they can cause loss of life. They can cause property damage, but they're things that we as a society recover from and we get back to normal, okay? And for some places, think about New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, did they ever really get back to normal? Is there a new normal? And people are asking the same question right now with the pandemic. We've made a huge shift in our way of life, and there's potential for more changes to come and more disruption and more things that could happen down the road. And people are asking, will we ever really get back to normal, as in the way things were before this pandemic, or are we looking at a new normal or a new way of life? And so as a prepper, I'm watching this very carefully because I'm saying, hey, there is some potential here that we could see not just, some temporary shifts in the way we do things, the way we work, the way we interact with each other, but maybe some more deep-rooted permanent shifts in the way we handle money, in the way our economy works, in the way our supply chains work, especially our food supply chains. And so we may start to see some disruptions that, could go, we could see some smooth transitions where we figure it out as a society, we move on, and we still function as a society. But there are some scenarios that I'm concerned about right now where we could see what I call a total societal collapse, or a TSC, if I'm abbreviating it. But a total societal collapse, it's not the apocalypse, right? It's not Judgment Day. So as a Christian, I don't like those terms because scripturally, Judgment Day is not something you prepare for by stockpiling food or by, putting together a bug out bag. Judgment Day, as a Christian, scripturally, Judgment Day is the literal end of the world. Jesus comes back and we all go to heaven. And we don't need to necessarily prepare for that the same way we would prepare for a hurricane. Like, you're not escaping that, I guess. And if you're a Christian, you don't want to escape that. You're looking forward to the second coming of Christ, and it's not something to be afraid of if you're a Christian. So I don't like calling it Judgment Day, and I don't see it as like the end of humanity or an extinction event. I'm not talking about those kinds of things. What I'm talking about is a total societal collapse where our society, the way that we live right now, ceases to exist. So civilizations and societies have risen and fallen all throughout history. That's nothing new, right? You look at even the largest empires, the most successful empires eventually fall. And we are in an interesting time because we are in a very global society. And I know there's people who want to, they're trying to shift away from globalism, but like it or not, we're in a very global society where we are very interconnected with other nations. Transit, communication, those are all very rapid and, almost seamless, where the borders, between different countries are not what they used to be, right? Going to another country is not today what it used to be back then. And when I say today, I'm, obviously right now there's some crazy stuff going on, but what I want to emphasize is that if we see a total societal collapse, it could be country specific, it could be the United States specifically, or it could be global. And when I say society, I'm talking about the way that we live and function. So we have law and order. That's a big one that I'm concerned about. Where a lot of people don't feel the need to be prepared to defend themselves because they're dependent that the police, fire, EMS, those are all going to be there if they need them. So that if somebody breaks into your house, you can call 911 and the police will come. Right? That's part of our society, and that's something that is very fragile when you really look at it. The idea that you can call 911, you can get a fire truck, police officer, and an EMT, you can get all, whatever, or all of those, or whatever it is that you need by calling 911, and you don't necessarily have to, think about it beyond that. Imagine if that was no longer there. Imagine if you call 911 and you get a busy tone, or it just rings and nobody picks up, right? What would you do? Somebody's breaking into your house, you call 911 and nobody picks up. Or somebody picks up and says, yeah, it's going to be an hour or more before we can get somebody out to you. And somebody's breaking into your house right now. What are you going to do? There's rioting and looting in the streets in your neighborhood. People are, driving down the street and shooting, drive-by shootings. You call the police and they say, you know what, we want to get somebody out to you, but we're so overwhelmed right now. What do you do? For me, that sort of thing, I get up and leave. I would be out of my neighborhood so fast if we reached that point. And even if we just got a hint of that, like even if it was just a matter of, hey, I'm seeing a sharp increase in crime, or I'm seeing people out on the streets, vandalizing, setting things on fire, or whatever. There's riots happening, there's looting happening. I'm out of my neighborhood. I'm getting out. And so being prepared to do that is really important. Another thing that can lead to this breakdown of law and order. So it's like, how does that happen? How do we reach that point? Now there's civil unrest, and one of the things I'm concerned about is in November, assuming Trump wins re-election, which I predict that he will at this point. I think that's pretty, not necessarily certain or guaranteed, but it's pretty likely. If Trump wins, there's a lot of people that are going to take to the streets, and I would not be surprised if there is violence and there is rioting. It's happened before, and I think it's going to happen on larger scales if he wins a second term. Because there's a lot of people who are going to be very, very angry, who've been angry for 4 years, and are going to continue to be angry. And their anger is only going to ramp up with everything they've done to this point to try and prevent him from being reelected fails. I think there's going to be civil unrest. I think there's going to be rioting in the streets. I think that's going to happen. Now, hopefully it wouldn't be temporary, but regardless, I don't want to be in my neighborhood on election night one way or the other. I'm currently not planning to be in my neighborhood at that time, because we'll see what happens, but I'm making those plans. So those are things to really think about and say, okay, what happens if we lose law and order? What happens if there's rioting in my neighborhood? What am I going to do? Can I defend myself? Can I defend my home? Or do I need to be prepared to leave? And the other thing I was going to talk about is the food supply or the supply chains. So we had kind of a scare with this in March when all of a sudden the grocery store shelves were empty of things like toilet paper, paper towels, hand sanitizer. My grocery store still doesn't have hand sanitizer or isopropyl alcohol. We still don't. And, you know, we have toilet paper now. we have, we have most foods back on the shelves, but for a while, like, you know, I went to Walmart and you couldn't find eggs. You know, things like that are scary because it's like, well, what happens if all of a sudden we can't go to the grocery store, or we go to the grocery store and there's nothing on the shelves or very little on the shelves and we can't buy the things that we need to feed ourselves and our families? What do we do? And in those situations, you have people who are prepared, right? You have people who have a plan, or who have supplies stocked up, and then you have people who don't. And people who don't, if it's a long-term shortage or if it's a long-term supply chain problem where you cannot access the food and supplies you need at the grocery store because for whatever reason, people get hungry, and when people get hungry, they get desperate, and when they're desperate, they'll do all kinds of things. And that's where you get into the looting and the rioting and the collapse of law and order, because if all of a sudden a large segment of the population cannot access their basic needs, they're going to get angry, they're going to get desperate, they're going to take to the streets. And the police cannot handle a large mass, riot like that. You know, there's limits to what they can handle. Our current setup of police and law enforcement is dependent on the majority of people being relatively chill about everything. You know, like the majority of people are not out on the streets rioting and looting. If a couple of people are out making trouble, the police can handle that. You know, whatever percentage of the population, they can handle that. But if a larger percentage of the population takes to the streets because they're desperate and hungry, then we have a real problem. And that's what I'm concerned about right now, is that if our food supply or our supply chains in general begin to break down because of all the different things that are happening right now, or if we have an economic collapse that causes them to break down because of inflation, because we're printing money to solve all our problems, we're just gonna, it's like, oh, well, we need money for this, let's print some more. You know, we're just printing money like crazy and we could get hyperinflation. But if any of those things disrupt people's ability to buy food and buy supplies for their family, the majority of people don't have another means of feeding their family besides going to the grocery store or going to a restaurant and buying food. If those two things don't cease to be options, the majority of people are gonna be hungry and desperate. And so as a prepper, I'm watching the news, I'm watching these things happen, and I'm saying, okay, I need to make sure that my plans are in place, that my supplies are in place, and that I'm prepared so that if this, gets worse, if this continues to go the direction it's going, I need to be prepared to get out of my neighborhood before things get really bad. I don't want to be trying to leave my neighborhood when people are in the streets rioting. I want to be out before then. And that's tricky, because how do you know when it's going to happen? And I don't have a clear, perfect answer for that. But you're watching for signs. You're watching for the different things that are coming together to create a situation where people are hungry and desperate. And sometimes you can kind of see it beginning. Like, especially if we get to the point where, you can't buy anything for a long period of time. None of the stores have basic necessities, or the stores are shut down and people can't get to them. The stores have to close because they don't have enough employees, because too many people are home because of coronavirus and are either unwilling or unable to come into work, and the stores have to shut down. They can't staff. That would be a problem. Or if there's problems in the supply chain where they can't keep stuff on the shelves. That's where you could get people get panicky, desperate, hungry, and that's where you can kind of see that coming, and that's kind of your cue. Like when we get to that point where, okay, there's nothing on the shelves, people are starting to freak out, it may be time to get out of your neighborhood, especially if you're like me and you live in the city And if you're like me, I live in an area that's not the best crime rate wise, not the safest necessarily. And we have a lot of interesting people in our neighborhood who their stability, not so certain, not so stable. And there are some people who I worry that in our neighborhood that I like, if things got really bad, I can kind of tell you who would be the ones to come out and on the streets and start causing a fuss, and I've seen hints of that even before all of this. So it's just kind of like, all right, who's, or in my neighborhood, what's going to set people off? And if people get set off, I don't want to be here. So having things coordinated and prepared so that if my husband and I needed to leave quickly, we could grab our stuff and go. That's a big part of prepping. Another big part is, what do we do? Where do we go and what do we do when we get there? And so having a bug out location. Now this could be a cabin in the woods that you own. If you have land like out away from the city and you have a cabin or a house somewhere out there, or you have otherwise some kind of bug out location, that's great. It could also be a friend or a family member who lives either in a suburb or a more rural area that would be safer under these circumstances. So it could even just be somebody who you have this arrangement with. Now, it's really important that if your bug out location is somebody else's house, that you have this arrangement with them, that you discuss this with them. You discuss your concerns, they're on the same page with you, and they agree to have you come live with them. Now, it could be a family member where that's kind of a standing agreement is, yeah, you can come over anytime, or whatever you need, I'm here for you. That's one thing, but having those discussions. So, I have my bug out location, it is somebody else's house, and I've had this conversation with them of, okay, if things get really bad, they understand. They're not preppers the way I am. They have kind of some supplies, they have some preparations, but not to the extent that I am. But there's kind of an agreement that, all right, I have plans, I have supplies to a certain extent, I kind of am prepared for this scenario. I'm going to come to you if things really get bad, and together we're going to work together to survive it and to thrive in the midst of whatever's going on. So it's kind of this arrangement where we're going to work together and help each other out should that happen. And they're kind of providing the location, and I'm providing some of the knowledge and research and some of the supplies, and we're going to together kind of work to figure that out. So I've had that conversation. We've had that agreement. We have this understanding where they're expecting me, should things go bad, they're expecting me to come and my husband to come. Because what you don't want to do is show up unannounced when things go bad, because especially if that other person is a prepper, they hopefully are prepared to defend themselves, even potentially against friends and family. So if you are prepared, if you are a prepper and you have supplies and you have a plan for you and your immediate family, but you don't necessarily have the supplies and strategy to protect everybody you know and love, you may have to turn people away who you otherwise would not turn away. Like, you may be in a position where you have to turn somebody away who you care about because you don't have the supplies and setup to take care of them. And so you need to have these conversations now before it becomes an issue. You don't want to be having those conversations in a time of desperation, because people are not rational when they're desperate. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm going to go to my grandma's house, oh, I'm going to go to my friend's house who lives out in the country, have the conversation with them. Don't just show up unannounced, okay? Or even call them up when things are going bad. Say, hey, I'm coming over. Talk to them now. Make those plans, okay? So I want to say that because I want people to start thinking about this, because I think more and more people are waking up to the idea that we could see some real serious things go down in the next few months to a year, especially because they're telling us that things are still not quite opened up yet. Some states are saying that they're trying to open things up, but it's moving very slowly, and it's going to go into the summer. Like, states are going to start opening things up throughout the summer, but in the fall we're going to have flu season, and they're saying this is going to come back, right? And that we're not going to have a vaccine yet, and I'm going to do another video about the vaccine and the issues with that. But we're not going to be, out of the woods with this, and then it's going to come back. And I think we're going to have shutdowns again. I think things are going to, we're going to have some of these issues come back. And so I'm concerned that maybe not right now, but maybe this fall and winter, we could really see some supply chain problems, and we could really see some cases where people are not able to get food, especially because right now we're in the middle of like growing season for farmers, and like over the summer there's going to be harvests, there's going to be more food that's going to be coming out this fall, this winter. Might be a different story. So have these conversations now. And it doesn't have to be because of coronavirus. It could be anything. It could be because of the elections in November. There's unrest in your neighborhood, or whatever. Like, have those conversations with that person that you're going to team up with. Same thing if you've got friends or family members who, in your mind, hey, if things go bad, I want to team up with them. I want to make sure they're safe. I want them to come to me, or I want to work with them if we have to go somewhere else. But I want to meet up with them and coordinate. Have those conversations now, because if communications are cut off, you need to make sure that you have a plan for where to meet up and when to meet up, and who's going to be part of your group. If you're going to have kind of like a survival group, you need to have those conversations and make those plans now, and preferably even run drills of, well, what happens if we can't communicate with each other, or whatever it is. So have those conversations. And as far as supplies, this is a really tricky thing because we're in a tricky time right now where in some places grocery stores are stocked again. In my grocery store, for the most part, is stocked. There's still a few things that are hard to get, but for the most part, we're kind of back up as far as the supplies go to normal, but that may change because we're starting to see problems. Like there's that meat processing plant that had to shut down. If we see more of those things happen, we could see some of those supply chain problems come back even in the next few weeks. So I don't want to tell people to go panic buy, right? Panic buying is not prepping. And this I want to be really clear about. Panicking is not prepping. If you go to the store and you buy every single jar of peanut butter because you're worried there's not going to be peanut butter tomorrow, guess what? There's not going to be peanut butter tomorrow because you bought every jar and they're not prepared to restock the entire shelf every single night. So don't go buy every jar of peanut butter or every can of soup or every thing of pasta or every roll of toilet paper. Don't do that. If you're going to stock up on food and water and supplies, you need to be strategic. You need to have a plan, not just a panic. Don't go to the store and just fill up your cart with stuff that you think you might need. You need to have a plan. And ideally, you've already, hopefully you've got some stuff already stored up, or you've had some preparations in place before all this happened, but chances are maybe you haven't, because most people haven't. And so, ideally, my hope is that we get out of this initial, that we get kind of into a lull over the summer, and then we kind of open up and go a little bit back to normal, even if we're not 100% back, that we at least kind of have some normalcy again. And that people have the opportunity then to prepare for the fall and winter. So if things do calm down over the next few weeks or a couple of months, and let's say in July, maybe they lift the restrictions on masks. Maybe we're back to kind of, and we're not having to stand in line to get into the store because they can only have so many people. Like maybe we start to ease up on some of those things, and the supply chains are back to normal because all the processing plants have opened back up, that sort of thing. If in, say, like July, we're back to normal, that's the time to stock up. But again, not out of panic, but with a plan. And so when you're planning for food storage, you want to make sure that you're looking at least 2 weeks of food. And normally I would say a couple weeks of water. Right now I'm not seeing, I don't have a concern right now with our water distribution systems or water filtration. I'm not seeing any signs right now that that's going to be a problem, at least not anytime soon. So I wouldn't tell you to go, in general, you should have water stocked up, but I wouldn't tell you to go out right now or even over the summer necessarily and stock up on a whole bunch of water. I would say look into water filtration systems, because it's much better if we do have some kind of crazy total societal collapse, rather than just having 2 weeks worth of water in bottles or jugs in your closet or in your, in your pantry, or your garage or whatever. It's much better to have a system to filter either rainwater, river water, lake water, whatever source of water you have near you. It's much better to have that kind of system in place or accessible than to have a whole bunch of water that's only going to last you a couple weeks. Like you need a lot of water to last you 2 weeks, and a lot more if you have multiple people in your household. So I think it's much better to have a filtration system than to have a huge stockpile of water, just because it takes up so much space and it's difficult to store. And then we run into people panic buying water, which is what we saw. Also, that was one of the things that was missing from the shelves when this all first started back in March, or when this became, a panic situation in March. So don't go buy pallets and pallets of water bottles. Look into filtration systems. So the Life Straw or similar things like that, where you can filter personally. You can have a little container of water and you can actually just drink straight from it through the straw. It filters it as you drink. Those kinds of things I would recommend. I have it's not a Life Straw. It's not that brand. I'd have to look at the brand. I might post it in the description or something. But it's something that you can, but it's something that's that idea that you can drink through it, or you can squeeze water through it or run water through it to filter it, and that way you can filter water and not worry about running out of your supply. As far as food, again, same kind of thing. You do want to think about being able to restock your food supply, especially if we get into any kind of prolonged supply chain problems. You may have to at least supplement your food supply with either things you can grow or things you can hunt or things you can barter for. So if you're not the gardening type and you're not the hunting type, you may want to think about how you could barter with somebody who is. If you know somebody, if you have a neighbor who has a vegetable garden, think about what skills or supplies you have that you could barter with them. If the supply chain went down and we all of a sudden couldn't buy stuff from the grocery store, or the supplies were very limited at the grocery store, would you be able to go to your neighbor and say, hey, I can do this for you, like complete this task for you, or I have this skill that I can give, maybe you sew, like maybe, hey, I can, do you need anything to be mended, like any clothes that need mending? I can mend stuff for you if you give me some of your vegetables, or whatever the case may be. So having that kind of system, or understanding what you could barter for or trade for with somebody who does have those preparations in place, that's another kind of thing to consider. You don't want too much of your prepping to be dependent on other people, because they may have their own plans, and you don't want to depend on, I'm going to trade with my neighbor for vegetables from her garden and then find out that she left town because she didn't want to stick around for that. So having kind of some backup plans for that is important as well. For me, just kind of to talk about what I'm doing, I do have a plan for gardening, for growing some supplies should I need to, at my bug out location. Like I said, I'm going to somebody else's house. They have the space that I don't have right now. I don't have space where I am because I'm in an apartment. I don't even have a patio or balcony. Like I don't have any space to grow food. And so I do have a plan they have space on their property where I could grow some food. And again, it wouldn't be a lot. It would be a supplement to whatever I'm able to get elsewhere. But it would be something. And even things that could potentially be traded. And as well as food crops, I'm also thinking about medicinal plants. Because again, if pharmacies are shut down, my husband and I both have medications that we take, and that we could get cut off from those. And so that's another thing to consider too, if you're on any medications, especially any that you depend on to live, any that you could die if you didn't have them. You got to think about what would happen if you got cut off from those. And for some people, that means you could actually talk to your doctor about having an increased supply. Like, hey, you normally give me, 30 days, 90 days worth of medication at a time. I want to have at least a couple of months worth, and just in case, because these are the things I'm concerned about. What if we have more shutdowns? What if whatever? What if there's supply chain problems? That sort of thing. And hopefully your doctor's understanding about that, depending on what your medication is and what the risks are for them of letting you have a whole bunch at home. But having those kind of conversations or having those kind of strategies is important. Also, depending on what your medication is for, or whether there are alternatives to your medication. For instance, like if let's say you take medication for depression or anxiety, there are medicinal plants that can maybe not replace, but can kind of in a pinch substitute for your medication. Again, I'm not saying go off your medication and go on herbal supplements, but I'm saying if you were to be cut off from the pharmacy and not able to get your medication, Are there medicinal plants? Are there things that you could use instead in a pinch, in an emergency, to help keep you on track? So again, I'm not telling you that you shouldn't be on your medication or that you should give up your medication in favor of, medicinal teas, but what would you do if you couldn't get your medication? What could you do instead? And having those plans in place so that you're not panicking. Again, it's to avoid panic. We don't want to panic. You want to have a plan so that you don't panic if and when something happens. So that's something I'm looking at right now, is what would be my gardening plan. And I'm also looking specifically with that at things that are easy to access seeds for. So one thing I'm thinking about planting is beans, because you can plant store-bought dried beans. So one thing I'm looking at in the near future is potentially buying some beans, because they do keep for a long time. And their germination rate, like how many of them actually sprout, is not great. But if you have a whole big bag of beans, and you can buy a whole big bag of beans for a couple of bucks, if even half of those will sprout, you could actually get some good plants going. So I'm looking at things like that, things where I could potentially access them even if the gardening stores are picked over or closed or out of stock, things where I could maybe get a hold of a little more easily when something happens, and things that I could stock up on now that won't go bad necessarily, before this fall or winter, when things start to happen. And that's the other thing to think about too, is if your plan is gardening and things go bad during the fall or winter, do you have some food storage so that you're not going hungry while you wait for spring? Because then you have to wait for spring in most growing zones, most growing regions. You have to plant in the spring or even late winter, and you're not going to harvest till late spring or summer. So you need to have a plan in place for that time. Like, let's say things go bad in November. What are you going to do until April? From November to April. And so having some alternate plans, backup food storage, that sort of thing is important as well, to think about those things. Another thing is hunting or fishing for food, because meat can be a really great source of nutrients and protein and all those things that you need. And especially if you don't have access to plants, or you don't have a way to garden, but you do have a way to go hunting, that could be another option. And so looking at things like, now in a lot of places you can't use hunting snares, like say, public lands and stuff. A lot of public lands, they don't allow you to use hunting snares. So what I'm talking about here is not doing this right now under our current conditions, but I'm talking about under a total societal collapse, where there is no longer law and order, where it is an every man for himself situation, where it is a do whatever you can to survive situation, where it's a survival scenario, not a convenience or a fun or whatever. It's survival, and you need food. I'm talking about, in that kind of situation specifically, the potential of setting some traps and hunting on some of those lands, even though normally that would not be okay, and that's currently not okay. But maybe in that survival, extreme, exigent circumstance situation, that could be something you could think about. And so hunting snares are actually really easy to make. There's a lot of good tutorials online, and all you really need is some wire and then things you find in nature. And so you can find some good tutorials for that. I bought some picture hanging wire, because that is one of the things that was recommended for making hunting snares. And so I'm going to have some rolls of picture hanging wire that I could then use to make snares. Again, if we reach this point where the food supply chain is broken down, people can't get food, law and order's broken down, or potentially even a situation where law and order's still around, but maybe some of those regulations are relaxed because the supply chain. Because I can imagine if we reach a point where the supply chain is broken down and people can't get food from the grocery store, I could see some states and cities and counties relaxing some of their hunting regulations because they understand that people are just trying to survive, or even just not enforcing them. So that's another thing I could see happening. But having that in place, having those plans, knowing how to create a snare, and even if that just means getting some picture hanging wire and practicing making the snares at home, even if you don't get a chance to really test them out, but just practicing based on the tutorials just so you've done it before, so that if you're in a panicky, desperate situation, you're not, you know, like you've done it before. You're not having to figure it out for the first time then, especially if whatever reason, power's down, internet's down, that sort of thing. So having those kinds of things in place. Another thing I purchased recently is a slingshot, again for the same reason of like hunting small game, because a slingshot is quiet, it's light and portable. So if I had to get up and go, if I had to walk out the door and leave, you know, my neighborhood on foot or by car or whatever, it doesn't take up a lot of space. It's not heavy to carry. And also, you know, you can have ammo, but if you run out of ammo for a slingshot, a small, as smooth as possible, round as possible pebble, like as round as you can get, will work. So you could potentially use rocks or pebbles for the same purpose, or as a makeshift ammo in a pinch. So that's the nice thing about that versus a firearm, which again is also part of my firearms are also part of my prepping plan, but as opposed to a firearm where if you run out of ammo and you can't get more, you're done. That's it. You're out. A slingshot, you can always find more ammo. So, and as far as firearms, I'll probably do another video just about firearms, but if you're in this prepping scenario and you're thinking about prepping and you're thinking about your prepping plan, how are you going to get food? How are you going to defend yourself if emergency services are gone? It's really important that you don't just run out and try and buy a gun without doing your research. So first of all, figuring out what kind of firearm you would want based on your skill level, your specific situation, and also figuring out if you've never shot a firearm before or if you're very inexperienced with firearms, making sure that before you buy one, that you either go to a shooting range if there's one open near you, some of them are still open, or find a friend who is a firearms person, you know, somebody who you know is into guns and who you know goes to the shooting range and you know knows what they're doing, asking them if they will teach you. And a lot of pretty much everybody I know who's into firearms, if somebody approached them and said, hey, would you help me, they would be more than happy to. Firearms, you know, gun people tend to be excited about new gun people, so we tend to be very like, yeah, sure, I'll show you, I'll help you out, you know. Also get to know the firearms regulations in your state, so that if you are considering buying a firearm, especially if you're buying one for the first time, there may be specific regulations that you may not be aware of. Including things like waiting periods, background checks. I mean, there's always background checks. There's no gun show loophole. We have background checks. You're gonna have to do a background check in order to buy a firearm. I promise you. And you know, some kind. And it may not be what you're thinking of as a background check, but there's gonna be some kind of check, database check or something that's gonna happen before you can buy a firearm. You know, I'm in Texas. We still have to have background checks. At the very least, the first time you buy, or however often, you know, not necessarily every single time, but at least at a certain frequency. But so those kinds of things you need to be aware of. I know a lot of people in California right now are getting a rude awakening because they thought they could just go out and buy a firearm, and they found out, oh wait, there's a waiting period, and there's all these rules, and there's all these things I can't buy, and there's all these rules about buying ammo, and how much ammo I can buy, and so they're discovering this for the first time and in the middle of a crisis, and that's not when you want to find out these things. You don't want to find out the gun laws in your state when you go to the gun store and try to buy something. You want to know before you go. And so look up the gun laws in your state, understand what does it take to buy a firearm, and also again what firearm you want to buy, what is available to you, because in some states there are certain firearms that are not allowed, that are allowed in other states, you know? And so knowing what your options are is really important. Again, talking to somebody, especially somebody who lives in the same state as you, who is into firearms, will help because they'll probably be more knowledgeable about all of that, and they can kind of help guide you. So be aware of those things, and know you cannot buy a firearm online and have it shipped directly to your house. There is no state where you're able to do that. To my knowledge, I don't know of any state where you can do that. And I know a lot of people in California were trying to have firearms shipped to them from other states, and definitely cannot do that in California. So I believe in 90% sure that in any state you have to have it shipped to somebody with the specific license And usually that's a gun store or a gun range where you can do that. There's a few other options, but so you need to be aware of those things. So you need to know the laws in your state, and what's going to take to have that. So all this just to say, please be thinking about this. Please make plans. Don't act out of panic. Prepping is not panicking. Panicking is not prepping. Prepping is planning. It's all about planning. It's all about making plans. If you have questions about specific kind of prepping scenarios or what I would do to prepare for certain situations, please leave them in the comments and I'll try to answer them as best I can. Also, there's great prepping blogs out there. There's a lot of experts who know more than I do. But this is just my little rant about prepping. So I hope you liked this. And if you didn't, well, I'm gonna post things and people like what they like. So speaking of which, please hit like, please subscribe, and all of that good stuff so that the algorithms put me out there. And I hope y'all have a great day. Stay healthy and safe, and be prepared.